Hey folks, welcome to a screencast on integrating NetIQ Access Manager 4.2 with Advanced Authentication Framework 5.4. For the demonstration, I'm using a VirtualBox environment. I already have a Ubuntu workstation running on it. Let's create a new virtual machine on this VirtualBox to install the NetIQ Access Manager 4.2 SP2. In fact, there are three main components for NetIQ Access Manager, namely IDP, Access Gateway, and Access Console. But for our demonstration, we would be making use of an appliance that has all these three components integrated in it. Maybe 8 GB of RAM should be sufficient to run this demonstration, and we would choose a disk that grows dynamically and probably would assign 100 GB of space. That should be sufficient for running this demonstration. So we now have a empty virtual machine. We would start this virtual machine, but before we do that, a couple of settings that I would like to point out to. One, of course, is the boot order. I would like to attempt to boot this from the hard disk. If there is nothing in the hard disk, obviously I would want it to look for the DVD, and the DVD anyway is going to be the ISO image of the NetIQ Access Manager appliance. Also, the network, I want to point it to the internal network because the Advanced Authentication Framework would need to communicate with Access Manager virtual machine. So I want those two virtual machines to be in an internal network so that they can communicate with each other without a problem. When I start it, it's prompting me to point to the ISO image of the Access Manager appliance, which is what I'm doing now. You could download these ISO images from the NetIQ download location. Like I said, there are three main components for the NetIQ Access Manager: Access Gateway, IDP, and Access Console, but all of these three are integrated into this appliance. It's of course beyond the scope of this demonstration to discuss each of that component in detail. Let's install the appliance. The installation is fairly self-explanatory. In fact, if you have had a chance to install a Linux operating system, the wizard that you would see now is very similar to what you might have seen while installing the different flavors of Unix. It's going to ask you for the host name, it's going to ask you for the IP address, it's going to ask you for the default gateway, the DNS information, the root user password, etc. In the interest of time, I would edit this video to make sure that you don't have to stare at the screen to go through every single stage of the installation. While editing, I would make sure that I do not omit important details, but be aware of the fact that the installation that you see in this screencast is edited, and the time required to complete the installation of this appliance would be a little more than what you actually see on this screencast. Like I said, the familiar screen, it's prompting you for some of the system identification details, like what should be its host name, the fully qualified domain name, IP address. I want to remind you that there is a Ubuntu workstation that's running on my VirtualBox, which is already configured to contact this particular appliance, in the sense that the /etc hosts of that Ubuntu workstation has been configured with this IP address, and that's mapped to nam.mydomain.com. It's asking me for the password for the administrator account in NetIQ Access Manager. The earlier password was for the root user of the appliance. So I would supply those details and continue with the installation process. So we have supplied all the details that are required for the installation. Now let's get started with installation. Like I said, I'm going to edit this installation process so that we save a lot of time. Now that the installation of the OS is over, you would also see the installation of specific components of the Access Manager as well as its configuration Again, while editing, I'll make sure that I do not omit important details that are displayed during the installation process, just that I have made sure that you don't need to stare at the entire installation process, wasting your time. In fact, you can see the three components that we mentioned, which is the administration console, the identity server, and the access gateway there. All the three of the components integrated into the appliance. In a real world scenario, obviously you would have to architect your solution in a way where it's possible that these three components sit on different machines. So we have the login screen. Let's log in as root user there. Maybe run a basic command to find out what is the IP address of this machine. To confirm that we indeed have the IP address that we set. That's right. So let's now go to the Ubuntu machine that we have, switch to the virtual machine that runs the Ubuntu operating system. We'll go to the etc host file to verify that we have mapped the IP address to hostname and fully qualified hostname. We can make sure that we are able to reach out to that machine by using the ping command, maybe using the fully qualified domain name as well. So all good. Let's open a browser and then before that, let's get into that machine once to make sure that we have SSH access also to the machine there. There you go, we are inside the NetIQ Access Manager appliance there. Now let's pull up a browser and try accessing the URL for the administration console of Access Manager. That's going to be nam.mydomain.com/nps. Let's accept the certificate. Log in as the top level administrator, which is admin. You would remember the password that we gave the admin there. Now this is the familiar iManager. In case if you have worked on any of the NetIQ products, you would be familiar with the screen. This is the iManager. So we have identity servers and the access gateways there, which you could administer. What I would like to do here is to access the embedded e-directory. The Access Manager has embedded e-directory where it stores the configuration details as well as the admin user. Usually you will have a different instance of the e-directory where you have the identities, but for our demonstration we would make use of this embedded e-directory to have users. There are a couple of users there. We'll create a new one. Maybe I'll use my very favorite identity to be created there. That's the famous fictitious character Sherlock Holmes there. Let's give it a password. And also another important attribute that I would like to give for this user is the email address, because during the course of this demonstration we would be sending a one-time password to this user to log in. So it's important that this user has an email address. These email addresses are pre-configured on my mail server. That's the reason why I gave contact@mydomain.com as the email address for this user. So we created a user in the embedded e-directory of the Access Manager. Mind you, in a real world scenario you would have a different identity repository, like a separate instance of e-directory or Active Directory. Now I'm accessing NIDP, the portal. Maybe I'll be trying to log into this portal using the user ID shomes and see if I'm able to access the portal of Access Manager. There you go. These are the different authentication contracts that exist currently. 3 of them. We'll supply the password of shomes and see if we are able to get in. We are in. So that works fine. One thing you might want to observe here is that the user shomes was able to log into this portal by supplying just the username and the password. So that was only a one-factor authentication there. Now that we have our Access Manager running, let's create a new virtual machine. This time around we will be installing the Advanced Authentication Framework 5.4. Obviously that's not the latest version of the authentication framework there, but we would make use of 5.4. It's not going to be too different if you try to install 5.5. 1 GB is sufficient. We'll create a hard disk of 8 GB in size, and the same old settings we would give for the boot order. Attempt to boot from the hard disk. If it doesn't find anything on the hard disk, try to boot from the optical drive, where we would have the ISO image for Advanced Authentication Framework. And now that this virtual machine would interact with the Access Manager, let's give it internal network. It's asking me for the ISO image of NAF, so let's point it to the Advanced Authentication Framework 5.4, and let's get started. Again, the installation process is self-explanatory. The embedded OS, or the operating system that this appliance uses, is a Debian flavor of Unix. So let's accept the end user license. Wait for the installation to finish. Again, I'm going to edit this installation a bit to make sure that we don't have to spend too much time looking at the screen, watching every single message that pops up during the installation. So when you do the installation of Advanced Authentication Framework, the time that you might need to complete the installation may be a little more than what I'm doing now. Okay, let's apply a password for the appliance administrator. Again, we would need to supply a password for the administrator, user of the appliance. This is the appliance administrator password that we just supplied. Of course, it didn't prompt us for any other details like IP address for this appliance. All that would be configured once this appliance comes up. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a Debian flavor of Linux operating system that's being used for the Advanced Authentication Framework there, whereas you might have observed that the NetIQ Access Manager uses a SUSE Linux there. Of course, it's attempting to do a DHCP broadcast, but I don't have a DHCP server in place. So once we have this appliance up and running, we would use the menu of this appliance to configure a static IP address for this appliance, and that would obviously of the network 192.168.0.x, so that it can talk to the access manager that we installed a little while earlier. Again, I have edited this booting process a bit so that we save a lot of time. For that reason, when you try to install Advanced Authentication Framework on your local instance, you might require a little more time than what I'm taking here. Right, so we don't have the network configured yet. Let's configure a static IP address for this appliance, 192.168.0.102. Remember, 101 is the access manager and 100 is the Ubuntu workstation that I have. I don't have a default gateway yet. I would give a dummy IP address there, and I don't have a name server, so I've configured the Advanced Authentication Framework. Now let's go back to the Ubuntu workstation that I have, or maybe before that, let's change the host name of our NAF appliance. Done. Let's go back to the Ubuntu workstation, pull up a browser and try to access the administrative interface of the Advanced Authentication Framework there. So let's get into the Ubuntu workstation now. Open a new tab on our browser and access 192.168.0.102/admin. In fact, that's the URL that we would use to access the administrative interface of the Advanced Authentication Framework. So it's in the start state. We are expected to configure this maybe as a new cluster, or it could also be joining a cluster, but in our case this is the very first instance of the Advanced Authentication Framework, so it's a new cluster. What should be the DNS name of the appliance? IP address would do. The admin user of this administrative tool has a password, and that's what you're setting now. And remember, you also observed a repository by the name local. We'll come back to that soon. The data that is kept in the local repository of the Advanced Authentication Framework needs to be encrypted, and for that we can generate a key, and that's what we are doing now. And then we go to the next page, which will prompt us to restart our appliance. It will take approximately 30 seconds for the appliance to restart and the new configuration changes to take effect. So it started the countdown, as you can see on the screen there. That's 25 seconds, 20 seconds. So every 5 seconds you get to see a status update saying that it's going to do a restart now. The appliance is restarted, and now you're going to get a login screen where we would log in as the admin user there. Like I said, local indicates the local repository of the Advanced Authentication Framework, and the password is stored in the local repository of the Advanced Authentication Framework. So we logged in as admin user. So we have this nice UI where we can configure the Advanced Authentication Framework there. We'll get to that very soon, but to start with, let's configure a repository. Currently all the users are located in the local repository. In fact, there is only one user, and that's admin. We'll add a new repository, which is eDirectory. Remember, we have an embedded eDirectory with the Access Manager, so we will configure that eDirectory. Let's give it a name, and also the base DM. That's where you want to start searching for the user. It's O is equal to novel when it comes to the embedded eDirectory of the Access Manager that we installed, and the top level administrator of the eDirectory whom we would be using for performing the search operation. That's cn is equal to admin, and that user's password is what we would specify here. So we are configuring a second repository in AF, which happens to be the embedded eDirectory of our Access Manager. Let's apply the IP address. Remember, this is the IP address of your Access Manager. That's where the embedded eDirectory is, and since we are going to use the secured socket layer, the default port is 636. Let's switch it on and hit on the check mark there. So that's done, and let's save it. You would see that we will get an option to sync. So now let's try and sync the data from the embedded eDirectory to the Advanced Authentication Framework. Of course, you would see a message that says since fast sync is not a feature that exists in eDirectory, you will have to go edit that and then hit a full sync there. Let's try and do that. Now this should synchronize the user data from the eDirectory to the Advanced Authentication Framework. Now it's not going to really copy the data from embedded eDirectory to the Advanced Authentication Framework. It's actually going to be a pointer there. Now we have two repositories there. One is a local repository, and the other one is the eDirectory, which happens to be the embedded repository in NetIQ Access Manager. Let's log out and try login with the user ID that exists in the eDirectory. And for that, let's use a URL /account. Obviously, the users in the embedded eDirectory are not administrators, and the repository name is not local, it's eDirectory /shomes. You remember shomes is the user we created there. It's of course prompting me for the password. Let's apply the password of shomes, and as you can see, it lands on a page where it lists to me the enrolled methods. These are authentication methods that are currently enrolled for the user shomes. So there is only one authentication method that is enrolled for the user shomes, and that's LDAP password, which obviously is the eDirectory credential there. So we have our Advanced Authentication Framework up and running. We can go back to that as an administrator, local administrator, and I wanted to show you something here. There are different config. So obviously I need to get out of this page and access the administration URL. So let's clean it up and say admin, and now log in as local /admin. That's the top level administrator for the Advanced Authentication Framework. And now let me point out to you, there is something called endpoints here. Of course, repository is a directory already configured. We will come back to methods, change, events soon, because we are going to configure this sometime very soon. But keep a close watch on the endpoints here. There are only 4 endpoints that you get to see here. Just keep a close watch on it and keep this number 4 in your mind. There are only 4 endpoints. It's basically the endpoint that the Advanced Authentication Framework would interact with to ask for authentication or to supply the result of the authentication there. Let's log out, and the next step that we are expected to do is to install a plugin in the Access Manager that let Access Manager talk to Advanced Authentication Framework. And by the way, we need to do this step only because you're using a 4.2 version of the Access Manager. The newer version of the Access Manager, which is 4.3, does not require this plugin installation. It's there inbuilt. So let's do a SFTP to the Access Manager there, our appliance. We're going to copy the file NAM plugin. You could download this again from the download location. Let's put it under the TMP directory. Again, the idea is to install this plugin so that the Access Manager appliance can talk to Advanced Authentication Framework. You remember we already have a terminal that's opened for the appliance. We just need to make sure that we have set our path correctly for Java. So that's the plugin there. We need to unzip that, of course, and we get access to a jar file, which happens to be the plugin. You can also see there are a number of JSP files that are bundled as a part of this package. So the plugin is actually the NetIQ NAM AA plugin setup.jar. That's what we would be running now using the Java command. Obviously, we have to set our path properly to point to the Java command. I have to remind you that you do not have to perform this step if you are using Access Manager 4.3. This is only meant for the versions like 4.1 and 4.2, and this plugin is required for the Access Manager to interact with the Advanced Authentication Framework. So let us set the current directory as a part of the path variable so that it can fetch the Java command, and I can run the Java command to install this plugin. So of course the path is set. Now I can safely run the Java command to point to the jar file that we have. So java -jar, and then specify the name of the plugin there. So that'll install the plugin so that the Access Manager can start interacting with the Advanced Authentication Framework. Again, the installation process is straightforward. It prompts you to read an agreement. Whether you like it or not, you will anyway have to accept it. It'll ask you for the path, of course. You go with the default, that should be fine. Then it'll now start asking the different authentication methods that you want to install. For the sake of convenience, I'm going to accept all of those authentication methods. So Access Manager eventually would like to leverage all these authentication methods that are there with the Advanced Authentication Framework. Of course, in a real world scenario, depending on your requirement, you may opt not to install one or more of those authentication methods that exist. That's the IP address of Advanced Authentication Framework it is asking. Remember it to be 102, and the port is 443, and that's why it is HTTPS there. So looks like we are good. As you can see, it's installing the packages, and let's see what happens once we complete the installation of this plugin. Let's say no to this. We don't want an installation script. So it looks like the installation has gone through fine. At least that's what the message says. Now we may have to go and restart our IDP so that this change take effect. So let's go to the Access Manager NPS URL and log in as the top level administrator there and restart the IDP. Log in as admin, and let's click on identity servers there, and then we would stop and start the server. Let's select it, stop. Looks like it's stopped. Now let's go back and select it and say start. Let's go and do a refresh and see if it started. like it started. So let's now close it and go back to the Advanced Authentication Framework to see if something has changed there. You remember the let's log in as local/admin. So using in the local repository of the Advanced Authentication Framework, there's an admin user. Supply the password for the admin user there. Now remember the endpoints, we only had 4 entries, but now we have a new one, which is nam.mydomain.com. So NetIQ Access Manager is also going to be an authentication endpoint for the Advanced Authentication Framework. That's what it says. And obviously, as you can make it, this entry was added as a result of the installation of the plugin in Access Manager. Now let's go back to the Access Manager. We need to do some work on the Access Manager, at least in 4.2. Obviously, a great deal of work is not required when it comes to 4.3 because this plugin is default there in 4.3. I'm going to create an authentication class. Now, an authentication class is a Java class that defines an authentication type. For example, LDAP requires username and the password. So again, there has to be a Java program that runs to authenticate the user of a specific authentication type. In here, we have to define a class for our email authentication, meaning this method would collect email address of the user and authenticate the user against a specific database. That's what this particular authentication method would do. So we define the name of the Java class that's going to be responsible for processing the authentication using an email by a user. So we define the class, and now we have to pair this class with a method. In a layman language, what we are trying to do here is we are trying to pair this class with a user store where the user information is stored. Now in our demonstration, we have kept everything very simple. We only have one embedded E directory with us, so the user information is with the embedded E directory. I'm unchecking this because I want the first level of authentication here to be done against NAM, so that already the user is identified by the time the authentication gets across to NAF. The user profile is picked up from the NAM itself, Access Manager itself, and the user's email address is fetched from Access Manager, and then it goes to NAF for email authentication. Finally, contract is what defines the requirements to identify a user. So here you can club multiple authentication methods. So I'm going to define a contract by the name email contract and maybe a URI that uniquely identifies this. Of course, there are situations where you would use this URI. In case if you're using Access Gateway to protect URI, you end up making use of these URIs there. In our demonstration, we would make use of two authentication to identify a user. One is the user's username and the password from the LDAP server, for which we would make use of the NetIQ Access Manager. The second, of course, is email OTP, one-time password on the email. For that, we would contact the Advanced Authentication Framework. So let's give an ID for the card. You would remember that the NIDP URI of the Access Manager had 3 cards listed earlier. Now, if all things going fine, you would see a 4th card that will prompt you for 2 requirements. One, of course, is the user's username and the password from the LDAP, and the second one, of course, is the OTP that the user receives on its email. And all of that was defined in the, again, you know, I could use a image to identify the card. I was lazy to pick up an image that is specifically pointing to the email, so for the sake of convenience, I've used an image that was easily accessible to me, which is en masse. Let's say OK and restart our IDP there, update all. So we defined authentication class, we defined authentication method, we defined a contract, and we made sure that the card is visible in the NIDP. So if we have done it correctly, once we complete this update process, we access the NIDP URL, we should be in a position to see the cards listed in there. Let's do a refresh and see what is the status of it. Okay, now we'll close this, open a private browser and access the NIDP. Maybe we'll access the NIDP here. Let's look at the cards. Oops, we don't have the card listed there. I think a safe bet would be to go back to the terminal and restart our IDP there by using the rc novel IDP restart command. So let's clear the screen and run rc novel -IDP restart. Most likely this should solve our problem, and we should be able to see the card listed in the NIDP URL there. Let's go back to the browser. Maybe for the sake of convenience, we would pull up a private browser now and access the URL nam.mydomain.com /NIDP. Okay, let's take a look at the cards. There you go. We have the email OTP card there, which has two authentication methods in it. One, of course, is the LDAP username and the password. That's from the NAM. And the second is an OTP to the email, which we need to now configure in the Advanced Authentication Framework. So we already have repository configured, if you remember. Repository is local, and then there is an embedded directory. Let's go to the methods. So the method that we are looking at for our demonstration is email OTP and one-time password to the email. I'm not changing anything that is there by default. Let's change the sender email though. We will make sure that the email is sent by a username admin@mydomain.com. I have to remind you that I've already configured a mail server on my Ubuntu workstation, and here I want to create a new authentication chain. Chain is nothing but a group of methods, group of different authentication methods. Remember, in our case, we would like the user to authenticate using an LDAP username and the password in NAM, and then use the email facility of NAF. So in our chain here, we only will have email OTP, and the people who are affected by this chain is all users in this appliance. Again, you can specify a set of users by defining a role, but in our case, for the sake of simplicity, all users. And the reason why there is only one method here is the initial authentication of the username and the password for that user is going to be done by the Access Manager, and the NAF is contacted only for an email OTP. We already have a NAM event. Event is the trigger point. I mean, somebody has to trigger for the authentication. In our case, the endpoint or the application who would prompt NAF for authenticating a user is the Access Manager. So we'll specify the chain that needs to be used when the trigger happens from NetIQ Access Manager. It's going to be email, and the endpoint, you see it's already configured there. Let's define a policy, which is where we would specify the mail server information. I have to remind you again that I already have a mail server configured on my Ubuntu workstation, which has an IP address 192.168.0.100, and since I haven't set any SASL or authentication, I'm leaving the username and the password empty there, but that's not the recommended way. All the mail servers should be secured. In my case, I haven't. Now let's go back to the terminal there, or maybe I'll log out. I just wanted to check this. Let's try logging in as the shomes user by using the eDirectory repository. Homes. Remember last time when we logged in, there was only one enrolled method for this user. Now you can see there are two enrolled methods. One is the email OTP and the other one is the LDAP password there. Obviously, email OTP was added as a part of the NAM endpoint for all the users there. We'll do one thing. We'll get to the NAM appliance, navigate to the log file location of IDP. That would be under nam/IDP, I guess. Under logs, there is catalina.out. Let's clear the existing file. Maybe write dev null to the file and keep it opened by running tail -f catalina.out, so that we would be able to see the progress in that file. Open a private window, but before I do that, maybe I also want to okay, let's navigate NIDP. Remember last time shomes was able to log in just by username and the password. This time I'm going to use a different contract, which is email OTP. Of course, it's asking me for the username and the password. That's LDAP username and the password. I'm supplying the password for the shomes in LDAP. Now you can see it's prompting me for email. And if I go back to the log, you can see that it's using a multi-factor authentication there. And if I go back to my mail server, check for an email. I have an email from admin@mydomain.com. Let's read that email. Of course, it's not in a good format because I'm using the Unix mail client. So we have the OTP. OTP is 217579. Let's apply the OTP and see if we are able to get in as Holmes user. It's 2175 and login. There you go, I am in. So from one-factor authentication, I've managed to convert that into a multi-factor authentication by integrating the Access Manager with the Advanced Authentication Framework. That was fairly straightforward. This was 4.2 version of the Access Manager. In 4.3 you don't even need to install the plugin. It's even more straightforward. Thanks for watching.